Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Fabric Coffee session at Microsoft Fabric Cafe. My name is Merdad, the community lead of this lovely community, and I'm super excited to be here with another weekend of our Fabric Coffee sessions at Microsoft Fabric Cafe. So while we are waiting for everyone to join, uh, I would like to just go through my slides and just have a quick introduction. But in the meantime, in the chat, we can just say hi and let's see who we have on the call now. And yeah, with that said, let me just bring my slides up. Today, March 15, 2025, super excited to have our 27th annual Fabric Coffee session. And so we are in the community of Microsoft Learn, right? The tech community of Microsoft Learn. A great place, to be honest, for finding the resources, finding the roadmaps, and finding all the documentations related to Microsoft and Azure technologies, right? So, and of course, in the community, you can find your experts, your Microsoft actually Learn experts, and also your peers in order to share and learn from each other, right? Then the other thing is that for all of the for all of the uh, you know uh, technologies that we've got, there are some learning rooms, right? And based on your interest, based on what you are thinking about, uh, to just learn about, and just being in touch with your experts, there is a learning room. And in the bottom, of course, you can find the learning room URL, aka.ms/learning rooms. So in within those learning rooms, we've got our Microsoft Fabric Cafe learning room, which is focusing on Microsoft Fabric, and we provide and support learning sessions to Fabric users in all levels. It is a forum for everyone to learn, share, and grow skills together. In the bottom, we've got our social information, the YouTube channel, which is with the handler of @ Microsoft Fabric Cafe, that you can find all of the past recording of our Fabric Coffee sessions and all, of course, upcoming sessions there. If you missed anything, or if you would like to rewatch the sessions that you had in the past, feel free to watch them there in our LinkedIn page, which the QR code is landing you there. We are going to all of our announcements and about the sessions, and about the community, about Microsoft Fabric itself, Microsoft Learn, if there is any new challenge on the way, and you can get your certification, and if there is any announcement. And of course, in our meetup group, you can just join there as well. Just being, again, another channel just to RSVP, right? Just show your presence in the sessions. There's a code of conduct in our community. I do appreciate that always that you adhere to them. I know there was no problem so far, thanks God. And but I do appreciate if everyone adhere to these code of conducts. So in March, we had two sessions. The first session was our hybrid session. That in-person one was in Vancouver, Canada. We had great attendees. That was a great time to be in touch in person with our community members. And last week we had the session with Brian. That was also great session. If you missed that, just go and rewatch it. And for this week we have Andy Cutler, and with the topic of the reality of fabric warehouses and deploying models using DBT. So I'm not going to waste any time. Let me just invite Andy to the stage. Hey, Andy, how's it going?
Hello, I'm very well.
Thank you very
Yourself?
much. I'm doing well. Andy, I'm a bit concerned actually about the number of attendees for today's session. You know what? I think it was mid last week, past week actually, that our time in Canada just changed because of the saving date, and
Yep.
we are now 1 hour. I always mix them up. We are going an hour behind or ahead. I don't know. However, our time has been changed, and of course, it is going to be a bit uh, difficult for people to make it at that time, because in the other side of the world they are not changing the times. So it's happening, always, when we are transitioning, the times. However,
Nobody remembers whether it's forward
yeah.
or back. Nobody ever remembers at any time of the year whether you go forward or you
Yeah,
go
yeah,
back.
yeah. So, however, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with the community. That is really appreciated, and I'm looking forward to learn from you. But guys, if you've got any question during the session from Andy, feel free to add it in the chats, both in LinkedIn and YouTube. It is actually a live session. But before I hand it over to Andy, I would like to share this. It is not showing actually the complete uh, stuff. Let me just do it like this. Yeah. So, we have started actually a poll on our LinkedIn page for your, you know, uh, preferred time for having our weekly sessions. So, of course, based on the times that we are receiving, we are going to set our sessions from May, basically, because our April is already scheduled. So, feel free to vote for that. And based on those votes, we are going to schedule our sessions. It is very important for us to have everyone covered, and having the sessions for all the actually community members from around the world. Thank you very much for being here. And Andy, I'm going to just share your screen. If there's anything to add, Andy, before I hand over session to you, feel free to add it. If not, I can just hand it over and sit back and learn from you with drinking my coffee and enjoying that. Yeah.
Well, it is a cafe, so drink your coffee and we'll go through some DBT stuff.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool. We have a hi from Sahar. I, Merdad, and Andy from Vancouver. Nice. Thank you for being
Hello,
thank you
hello.
for being up. It is really important in Vancouver. Now we are at 7 a.m., right? And I know it is maybe not that easy to be awake, in the weekends. In the weekend, people just prefer to rest, but it is the community, and I love it. Cool. Andy, hand over to you. And yeah, guys, enjoy it.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. And yes, all the videos for the past sessions are on the Microsoft Fabric Cafe YouTube site. And we had I think we had the fastest medallion architecture in the world last weekend from Brian, and so many great speakers before and afterwards. And we're going to carry on with the fabric theme, obviously, but we're going to drill in to a specific service. So we're going to drill into the warehouse service within Fabric. But the warehouse service, it's a blank canvas, right? It essentially gives us what we need, but we have to then do the work, right? DBT helps us paint the picture. It helps us do the work that the warehouse does best. I'll explain why as we go through it. So welcome to this session for Microsoft Fabric Cafe, the reality of fabric warehouses and deploying models using DBT. So a little bit about me. My name's Andy Cutler. That QR code is for my link tree. That'll take you to all my socials, including my YouTube channel, LinkedIn, and my blog. I blog mostly at serverlesssql.com, and my company is at datahigh.co.uk. And I'm also part of the organizing team for a bi-yearly event called Data Toboggan. So we're going to have a call for speakers. We focus on data engineering, data warehousing, the sort of back-end stuff, really. So today we're going to be looking a little bit at Fabric and the warehouse service. I'm not going to touch too much on what Fabric is. We've got a slide, right? Just want to set the scene a little bit. We'll have a look at the warehouse service, why we would want to use it, and then we'll dive into DBT, right? What is DBT? Is it a solution looking for a problem? How do we use it in the context of Fabric and especially the warehouse service? And we'll look at some limitations and caveats, right? I want to do some of the real world about what you can't do and what you're going to have to look out for if you wanted to use a tool like DBT with Fabric Warehouse Service. We'll go through a demo, and we've got some riddles as well. So we've got about 3 riddles at the end that we can go through. So you're going to need to pay attention. So firstly, Fabric. Well, ultimately, Fabric has taken that data warehousing, data engineering, real-time analytics, machine learning, and incorporated those workloads in a familiar interface into the world of Power BI. So I always say it's added significant functionality to a Power BI tenant. Of course, now it's referred to as a Fabric tenant. Instead of having to worry about lots of different types of compute for lots of different types of services like Spark, like SQL, like Data Factory, we've got a single form of compute, which is capacity, where we're purchasing a certain number of capacity units that we can use in a certain time frame, and then we can use whichever of the services meets our needs and requirements in the data platform. This is software as a service, right? So it's different from, let's say, the data platform services in Azure, where we've got less control now with software as a service. We have some control over Spark, but services like data warehousing, we really don't have much control over the level of compute other than the overall Fabric capacity. And the biggest departure is that Microsoft have gone in on the Delta Lake format and the Parquet file format to manage the underlying storage in data warehousing, data engineering, and I guess this is one of the biggest changes in terms of a Microsoft solution, really. Now, in the context of using Fabric, what are you going to use Fabric for? Well, you're building an end-to-end data platform, right? So you've got all these source systems, you've got all this data in your organization in disparate systems. So within Fabric, you basically create pipelines and loading methodologies to load and ingest data. That can be batch, that can be real time. We can process and transform that data and ultimately land into one of the storage options that we've got. Lakehouse, warehouse, KQL, it all depends. And then finally, we're going to report. And we've got some machine learning in there as well, if we want to incorporate AI and analytics. So that's really what Fabric is for, end to end, right? DBT can help with some of this. Go through that. So in terms of the Fabric Warehouse, it's T-SQL, right? So anyone who is familiar with writing T-SQL can come to the Fabric Warehouse and carry on using their T-SQL knowledge. However, this is not SQL Server. We have a subset of T-SQL commands. So not every single T-SQL keyword is supported, right? There's actually Fabric documentation that tells you what isn't currently supported. But if you're a T-SQL developer, for very little transition, you can get yourself up and running with the Fabric Warehouse. But the way the Fabric Warehouse works is that it's auto scale. So essentially, when you issue a SQL command, this DQP, this query processor, ultimately decides how much compute do we need to be able to run the SQL command that's been sent to the warehouse service. And that could be one or many compute pools in the back end to actually complete that query in a certain amount of time. And that could scale out. And then another query could come in. It could reuse some of that back end compute pools and then return the results set if appropriate. But we've got some common objects, right? Tables, columns, data types, functions, stored procedures, everything that we would come to expect from a database. Except when we create a warehouse, what we're doing is we're actually creating a database. So in a Fabric workspace, it's a little bit like a server. So if we were to create a warehouse in a Fabric workspace, what we're actually doing is creating a database on a server. So this SQL endpoint that we can connect to will show these warehouses as databases. And as I said, the storage is underpinned by Parquet, the column store file format. Very good for analytical based systems, perfect for the warehouse. And all the transactions and the atomicity and consistency is all being managed by Delta Lake. And Delta also adds some features in there, like cloning, like time travel, that the warehouse can take advantage of. Now, where does it sit? Anyone familiar with building any data platforms? If you are building a dimensional model, if you are building a warehouse, that warehouse on a diagram usually sits on the, or more towards the right hand side. All the source systems and maybe your staging areas and raw data, that's more on the left hand side. So what we're doing here is we're using the warehouse very much for delivering, or as close to delivering, data for downstream reporting as possible, really. So anyone familiar with the medallion architecture, which is a term? Now you can discuss whether it's actually an architecture or not, or a pattern or a methodology, but ultimately we are laying out zones of data, our raw data, our cleansed data, and our model data. So the warehouse sits, or can sit, in that gold zone where we're creating our dimensional models, our aggregate tables ready for reporting. Now we've got this role that's appeared in the last few years called analytics engineering. That's essentially where DBT fits into the picture. Ultimately, an analytics engineer is responsible for taking cleansed data and turning that data into something that can be used for the business, something for reporting. Now, it could be a definition in terms of building data marts, data warehouses, but ultimately they don't touch raw data and they don't touch building reports. They go up to the point in which they're building semantic models, for example. So they may be able to build reports off that semantic model or teach analysts how to use the model to build reports, but that's not really their role and responsibility. So we've got this raw data and we've got reporting. And in the middle, we've got picking up cleansed data, we've got modeling that data for the business, and then we've got business facing models for reporting. In the world of Fabric and Power BI, that would be semantic models. Now, DBT, it used to stand for data build tools, but I think over time, DBT have sort of tried to get rid of people saying it stands for data build tools. And I think the term is just DBT. What does it mean? DBT. And I'm not going too off-piste in terms of explaining DBT. DBT themselves say, well, look, it's the transform part in ELT. So we've extracted data from our source systems. We've loaded that data somewhere. And now we're going to transform it. There could be another T between the extract and the load, but we're going on terminology here in terms of DBT picking up data that's already been loaded and then transforming it further downstream. So, for example, it can pick up raw data and turn it into cleansed. It can also pick up cleansed data and turn it into model data. And that's what I use it for, right? So personally, I use it, or I use DBT at the point in which I'm picking up cleansed data and I'm modeling it into a dimensional model, right? That's my use case. And ultimately, what it enables you to do is, instead of rolling your own frameworks and building your own SQL-based frameworks or Python-based frameworks to automate certain aspects of downstream schema creation and dependencies, DBT is doing this for you. And it's compiling the code to run on your chosen destination platform. So, for example, if you're using Databricks, if you're using Snowflake, if you're using SQL Server, Fabric Warehouses, DBT is running the code required for those services to work on the service itself. So DBT is not running any of the SQL or any of the code on its own compute. It's running it on your platform. So the SQL that DBT generates to run on Fabric Warehousing, it's being run on the Fabric Warehouse on the compute. And this terminology, this has tripped me up so many times, and it still does. It still does. When you're reading up about DBT, and when you hear the term model in DBT, it's not as in a whole model of objects. A model is a select statement. It is, or the result of a select statement. And that could be materialized as a table or a view in our destination system. So ultimately, a DBT project could contain several models. So, for example, if I'm building a star schema, perhaps my dimension tables, dim product, dim date, so on and so forth, each one of those is a model. But what DBT does is it's building a dependency. So there are keywords, and we'll look at those keywords when we dive into the demo, in which we can tell DBT how we're linking things together. So, for example, I've got a fact table. That fact table actually relies on getting the data from the stage web telemetry data. Okay, so I have a dependency to get the data from there, but I've also got a dependency on 2-dimension tables. In my select code within DBT, I'm adding in references to tables when I'm selecting. That allows DBT to automatically build out a DAG, direct acyclic graph, which is a dependency tree. And it will then run the loads in parallel and in sequence to meet the needs of that dependency tree. What I love about DBT is the schema management aspect of it. And this is something to get your head around if you're coming at this from, let's say, SQL development, where you're used to keeping your schema in a database project. So, for example, I've used things like SSDT, SQL Server data tools, database projects where I have my table schema and I've got my view definitions and my stored procedures all contained within a database project. And I'm using that to deploy. If I'm changing anything, I'm altering tables, I'm doing it in the schema, in the project, and I'm deploying that and I'm altering my objects during deployment. DBT manages that schema evolution. So what you do in DBT, you declare what you want your schema to be without writing any create table statements or alter table statements. DBT does the rest in terms of evolving your schema based on your definitions. And we can also generate documentation, right? So with a simple DBT command, we can generate documentation, and that's going to give us what we need to browse the metadata within the project. So it's very declarative. There are some great learning resources. In the last few years, vendors have done a very, very good job of making sure that they have great learning material. And look, it's in the vendor's best interests, right? You get some good learning material from a vendor, you're more likely to use that vendor and purchase services from that vendor. I remember the bad old days of struggling through not great documentation, if there was any. There's a tutorial on Microsoft's Learn website to how to set up the data warehouse. And there's a Udemy course. Now, I've got no skin in the game with this Udemy course, right? I'm not getting any kickbacks, right? But this DBT data build tool bootcamp 0 to hero is great. You'll get hands-on with how to set DBT up, how to install it, how to integrate it with an IDE, a development environment, and how it works. Their example goes through Snowflake, a couple of tweaks, you get it working for Fabric. Absolutely no problem at all. But DBT also have certifications. I myself am currently working through the Analytics Engineer certification. Now, with flavors of DBT, I'll be honest, my preference is using DBT Core. So this is an open source tool. Install it locally. It integrates into an IDE like VS Code. So I use it within VS Code. And there are some great VS Code plugins to enhance DBT as well. The best one is Power Tools, where some of that cloud only functionality we can get within DBT Core, within local. But of course, also with DBT Core, I can run that anywhere. If I want to run DBT Core on my local machine, which is what we'll do for the demo, that's what I can do. If I want to run it in containerized services, I can do that. But I have to look after it myself. It's my responsibility. The other flavor is DBT Cloud, right? So it's getdbt.com. There's a free version for a single developer, right? Up to a certain number of queries that you're running. But it's great. I mean, it's certainly enough for me to use DBT Cloud. And it's the path of least resistance when you're first getting up to speed with DBT. It really is. You don't have to download anything, get anything integrated or working. It just works in the cloud. However, at scale and from a productionized environment, you'll be spending money in DBT Cloud, right? The larger your project, the more that you're running, the more frequently that you're running, the more it's going to cost you, right? Okay, so going into some use cases with DBT. Now, this medallion architecture slash pattern, we can use that with DBT. So, for example, for me, what I'm doing is I've got some data in a lake house that's been loaded from a source system, whether it's the raw data, whether it's the cleansed data. I'm picking up my data from a lake house. I'm loading it into a warehouse. DBT can do that for me. Now I've put cloud there, but that could be core as well, running on my local machine. And within DBT, I'm going to be selecting data from that lake house, and I'm going to be transforming that data. And ultimately, DBT will be responsible for running that on the Fabric Warehouse and creating and populating tables. So I talked a little bit about one of the functionalities that DBT has, which is handling schema changes, right? When you're creating a DBT project, when you're writing these models, what you're doing is you're declaring a downstream schema. This is the output of your select statement. Of course, source systems can change, columns can be added, columns can be removed. You then have power over what you tell DBT to do. So you've got some options that you can say. So when you're creating DBT models in which you're not blowing away and recreating the table. So if you've got incremental changes, if you've got, which we'll see, tables set up as slowly changing dimension tables, we've got a property that we can use called on schema change. What does DBT do when it encounters a source change in your definition? Well, we can ignore it. However, DBT doesn't quite ignore it. If there are any new columns added, it doesn't add the columns. But if it detects columns missing, it will actually fail. So it doesn't truly ignore. We can fail, right? So if we've got some new columns in and we do want our model to fail processing, when we'll tell DBT to fail. Append new columns. Now, this is the one that you will likely use for the Fabric Warehouse. We'll get onto that in a bit. But what append new columns does is it adds new columns. So if it sees new columns in the DBT model definition, it'll add those in downstream to the destination. So if I've added a new column to my dimension table, it's going to modify that dimension table to add that new column in. But it ignores deleted columns. So if you've removed a column from your DBT model definition, that doesn't get deleted. Right? But hold that thought when we look at the limitations of the Fabric Warehouse. And sync, well, that should be sync all columns. New's been added by accident there. Essentially, sync all columns will add all the new columns that it detects. It will remove any deleted columns and it will change data types, right? So it'll align your model definition exactly with the downstream object that you've told DBT to work with, whether it's a table or whether it's a view. Now, when we look at incremental loads, we've got some options there in telling DBT in our configuration, in our, above our select statement, in our code, what to do if you have an incremental strategy, i.e. a fact table that you don't want to truncate and reload. What do we do? What would you like DBT, or how would you like DBT to deal with incremental data that's coming in? You can just simply append it, i.e. if you know for certain that the data that you're getting in a batch can simply be appended to a fact table, fine, use append. However, if there are changes to be made in existing fact records, you can use a strategy. Ideally, we may want to use something like merge if there are some updates. available. However, with the Fabric Warehouse, it supports appending data, so simply adding new data, and it also uh, delete and insert. So essentially what it will do is based on a key. So this is all, it needs a key to identify records. If it identifies a record that it doesn't know about based on a key, it'll just insert that record. If it detects a key that exists downstream, it's going to delete that row and then re-add the new row from your source. So limitations and caveats. The warehouse runs T-SQL. Microsoft have built the Fabric Warehouse to use T-SQL. However, it's their proprietary engine. It's their proprietary new analytics engine. However, not all commands are supported. So if you come in expecting to write a merge statement, currently not supported. That's coming at some stage. So all of that functionality that's available within SQL Server, we have a subset of that. I mean, SQL Server does a lot of things. Right? I love SQL Server, right? You've got to understand what's called the surface area, i.e., what syntax is supported and what syntax isn't. That drives what you can do with DBT, because DBT works with lots of different cloud platforms, works with Databricks, Snowflake, so on and so forth. So what you can do with one platform, you might not be able to do with another. If you've got a drop and create strategy, so for example, if you want to use DBT to populate business area focused data marts and dropping all of the tables and recreating the tables and reloading the data is not a particularly big overhead, and you can do that, well, the Fabric Warehouse works fine, right? Brute force, delete, create, and reload. There is what's called a materialization. There is a type within DBT called ephemeral. When you use an ephemeral materialization, basically, you're not asking DBT to actually create an object like a view or a table. This is useful for just if you want to stage and transform data. Now, it's not supported out of the box because Fabric Warehouse at the moment, or until very recently, so I probably should remove this caveat. I'm just keeping it in there for the time being. Is ephemeral materializations, they essentially, the code that's generated, they use nested CTEs, nested common table expressions, which the Fabric Warehouse, as of I think a week or a couple of weeks ago, didn't support, but it's in preview. Single columns isn't supported, right? And that's because at the moment, the Fabric Warehouse allows you to add new columns. It doesn't allow you to drop columns. Now, this could probably be a session in and of itself as to understand why the Fabric Warehouse supports certain features and doesn't, but it's all to do with being based on the Delta Lake protocol and Parquet. So ultimately, at some stage, we hope the warehouse will support what's called a Delta column mapping, or the most recent version of Delta column mapping, which allows us to add columns, delete columns, rename columns, and so on and so forth. So single columns is supported. Append new columns works great for the Fabric Warehouse because it detects new columns. It'll add them. If columns have been removed, it'll just ignore them. It gets quite chatty. So there are some DMVs within the Fabric Warehouse service in which you can look at what's being run. And you can see when you're running a DBT, any DBT commands, it's getting metadata. It needs to know, okay, I need to get some column metadata because I've been asked to run this model. Has anything changed in the schema? Okay, let's generate those SQL statements to change the schema. Now let's load the data, so on and so forth. So it does get quite chatty. You will see quite a lot of SQL being generated as it's querying the warehouse metadata. Understandable, because it needs to know, it needs to get metadata to understand what it needs to do to change things. I'm just letting you know about that limitation, or essentially what it's doing. I'm just having a quick look just to see whether there's any questions in the chat. So let's jump in. Right, so I'm going to open up, firstly, Fabric. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of creating, a workspace and a warehouse out of the scope of this, but I've got a Fabric workspace created, and I've already created a warehouse. It's a blank warehouse. There's nothing in it. So I'm going to go into the warehouse, and just to prove that there really is nothing in this warehouse, just going to refresh the schema. Actually, oh, okay. So we've got one table, dim user. That's because I ran something. Okay, so I'm just going to cleanse very quickly. Let's just drop that. Okay. So there we go. Okay. Very quick script, drops everything. I've got an empty warehouse. Leave that there. I have a lake house. The lake house is in the same workspace, and I've got some tables, right? I've got a table that's containing some raw dates. I've got a table that's containing some event types, some products, and some web telemetry data. So this is pretty simple data. It's just website telemetry about users browsing a website, looking at certain products on certain dates and times. And what do they do with those products? Do they put them in the basket? Do they just view it? Do they purchase them? So it's ultimately a funnel analysis process. So within my lake house, I want to model those as dimensions into my Fabric warehouse. Now I could start writing, create table statements in the warehouse. I could introduce my own framework and write dynamic SQL to create tables and things like that. But I'm not going to do anything in Fabric. I'm going to switch to DBT. But I'm going to run DBT locally. I'm going to run DBT core on my machine using VS Code. Okay, so I've installed DBT. I've also installed Power Tools. And when I've created a new DBT project, it gives me out of the box a whole bunch of folders and files that I can then use, modify, and start to add my DBT objects. So, for example, the folders like analysis and DBT packages, logs, macros, models, seeds, snapshots, target, tests. These are all default created when you create a DBT project. Now, in terms of authentication, and I've already authenticated, I'm actually using AZ login to just authenticate with the Fabric service, and then I can run my DBT. In something like DBT Cloud and also DBT Core, we have service principal support as well. So don't panic, we've got service principal support. Now, what I've done in my DBT project, in my models directory, which is my select statements, I've got two folders. I've got raw and I've got my star schema. So in my raw, I've got some models that goes and gets data from the lake house. So if I go into my sources file, so I'm just going to shorten this. I've created a sources file within my raw folder and told DBT, well, look, that's the physical name of the lake house that I want to connect to. And these are the physical names of the tables that I want you to be aware of when I then start writing my select statements. And I've aliased that physical name with a more friendly name. So when I'm referencing raw underscore lake house, I'm actually referencing the physical name of DELHDBT cleansed. And then for each of my raw loads, I have a select statement, which is ultimately what is output from these models. Okay, and as you can see, I'm using some syntax, or Ginger syntax, to reference the source, raw lakehouse, and reference the table, raw dates. Now, what this does is this helps DBT, to build a dependency. So if you're using source and ref, that helps DBT actually put together the DAG and actually show you the dependency, which I'll show you in a minute. Some of the configurations I've explicitly told DBT how I want it materialized. Right. So if I go down to my project file, I go down to DBT project. Okay. I've told DBT that by default, if I don't override any configurations, any models, any select statements that I write, I want you to materialize that as a table downstream. My stage data, I don't want to materialize that as a table. I just want a view because I'm maybe doing some transformations as I'm loading that data. So for example, my event type, it's a view. So DBT will create a view on the destination that it will then use further downstream if I reference this event type view. Okay, so there we go. So I'm just writing a select statement. Products materialized as a view. I'm writing a select statement, and the same for web telemetry. It's a view, and I'm going and getting the relevant columns that I want from that source. In my star schema, I've got some dimension tables and some fact tables. Now I'm building those dimension tables and fact table based on this staged data. So for example, if I look at dim date, you can see that I'm getting the data from STG dates. So now I'm referencing a model within another model. And again, this helps DBT build up that dependency because you are declaring to DBT, well, this has a dependency on this table. Then DBT can work out what is linked to what. So I've got dates. I've got products. I've got a utility command that I've imported to be able to do things like generate a surrogate key, generate a hash. Now in my fact web telemetry, it's something slightly different. If I scroll to the top, I've got a config where I've materialized it as incremental. So the very, very first time DBT runs this, it's going to just do a full load. After that, it's going to load the data based on a condition. And I've also told it, if you detect any changes in the schema, this is how I want you to deal with it. So I'm going to append new columns. And there's my transformation in my statement, right? I'm casting a date into a key. I'm generating a hash for a column. I'm referencing, and I've got this syntax to say, well, is it incremental. And it's a where statement. Okay. So I'm basically saying, okay, if it's incremental, go and get me the last date time for the date that was ran. Go and get the data from my staging table that meets this criteria. My final select, and then that's what will be inserted into the fact table. But because I've created these select statements, DBT is creating the schema, well, based on the source data types, really. I'm not overriding any of the data types here. So the data types available here will be what gets carried over and used in the warehouse. So I'm going to run this. So let's get a terminal up. I'm just going to run DBT and check everything is okay here. There we go. So I've got some DBT back. Okay. Now what I can do is I can say DBT run select. Now I can select the models that I want to run, or I can select folders, right? So for example, you might not want to run just everything. Part of the DBT documentation, it has some recommended practices in how to set up your projects, how you might want to look at setting up your folder structures. If you've got full loads, incremental loads, if you've got facts, if you've got dimensions, as an example, how to structure your DBT project, right? So I'm going to run my raw folder. So it's going to materialize these as views, but I'm also going to run my star schema, right? So I want to populate my dimensions. Okay. Now to traverse folders, we use dot rather than a slash that we used to, right? So I'm going to run that. And we'll let that run. And what it's doing is it's just working through dependencies. It's working through what it needs to create in terms of views, in terms of tables, and then it's running the code. Now, I just want to call out the DB or the Power Tools plugin that is available, third-party plugin. So actually, I've got this lineage, okay, that I can use. I mean, it's pretty simple lineage. It's just saying that, that fact web telemetry is connected to that stage view. Okay. So if I had, multiple tables connected to other multiple tables, you're going to be able to see this lineage here available within your IDE VS Code. Previously, it was only available within DBT Cloud. That was one of its selling points. But we've got lineage here. We can display lineage, which I think is fantastic. Now, if we nip back to the warehouse, okay, there we go. We can see our schema. And let me just refresh. We should see our tables appearing. There we go. We've got our dim date. We've got our dim product. Right. So we haven't had to issue any create table statements. We haven't had to manually deploy a schema, anything like that. The definition in DBT itself, the select statement is what manages the creation of the schema downstream. So under the hood, in the log of DBT, it's going to be showing you the SQL that it's generated and ran against the Fabric Warehouse. I can run my fact load. So let's run the fact load now in the terminal. Where was my terminal? There's my terminal. So let's run that. So I'll do a DBT run select, and then I will say star schema dot fact. So let's run that. Here we go. Fact web telemetry. It's going to run this, and it should be a few seconds to run. Okay, let's have a look. Let's just refresh until we see it. And there we go. We've got our fact web telemetry table. Okay, a few minutes left. With a data warehouse, one of the reasons that you may want to build a data warehouse is to track changes over time. In dimensional modeling, star schemas, this is known as slowly changing dimensions. And we have different ways in which we can deal with how we want to track history over time. DBT is essentially implementing an SCD type 2 process using a terminology called snapshots. Right? So DBT haven't included the word slowly changing dimension in their product. It's something you can do with snapshots. So for example, if we're going back into our DBT project, if I open up this snapshots folder and into star schema, we've got dim event type. Now, the business have told us that they want to keep track of changes in event definitions, right? So at certain periods of time when people are browsing the websites, the event may mean a certain thing. And over time, they may change the definition of DBT. They may change the definition of the events, and we want to keep track of what fact records are linked to there. We implement that with a slowly changing dimension. We're doing this with DBT in a snapshot. So for example, we're telling DBT that this model is a snapshot, dim event type, and we've got some configurations. Okay. We've got a unique key. So that's anyone familiar with data warehousing or dimensional modeling, the unique key will be our business key. So this will be the data that's coming in from our source system that we can key in on and then check others columns to see if there's been any changes. Okay, I have a strategy of timestamp, which means that in my source data, I'm lucky enough to have a field, a date time field that has told me when things have changed. If we don't have that, and I reckon about 90% of all the data sources I've ever worked with for the last 25 years don't have any form of field like that, we can use a hashing strategy. So we can use column strategies in which DBT will then check values of columns to see if they've changed, right? So we've got that. I've told DBT that my timestamp column is last updated. So I've got a column that does that. And then again, I can tell DBT what I want to do if I get some changed columns that have come in and I'm defining those in my model, right? And what I mean by that is if new columns get added to the source lakehouse, it's not automatically going to flow all the way through DBT. I still have to go and get those columns and define them. It just means in my model, if I add a new column, what does DBT do with that downstream? Okay. So if I run this snapshot, so let me run this DBT, I'm just going to run snapshot. Right. Now, bearing in mind, all I've done is written a transformation statement, as in, well, here are the columns I want. Maybe I'm doing some other transformation in that SQL. Doesn't really matter. But I haven't defined any metadata. I haven't defined any slowly changing dimension metadata. So anyone familiar with building dimension tables and adding slowly changing dimension metadata in will be familiar with things like, is current or valid from and valid to, and however you've named them, so on and so forth, which tell you what is a current row, what's an old row, what's the history of the data. DBT is doing all that for us. So if I go back to my warehouse, oh, there we go. Dim event type. It's already appeared. It's already refreshed in my schema. Okay, so there we go. So there's the data. So the data that's coming from the lakehouse is event type ID, the event type, the description, the last updated field, which is just a date field, which it could be a date time, an event category field I've just added there, DBT is then adding the other metadata. It's adding an internal ID, the updated, and the valid from and the valid to. And the valid from and to you can then use to find out what's your current row. So in DBT's world and in DBT's snapshot logic, anything with null in DBT valid to is your current record. Let's change something. If we go into our lake house, right, I'm just going to update one of the tables. I'll change the description of one of these event types. I'm going to change the last updated, right, because that's what triggers or allows DBT to see that there's been a change to a record based on this business key, this event type ID. So, yeah, got some questions. Yeah, I'll tell you what, while we're waiting for that to run, I'll answer those now.
Yeah.
So I tell you what, Pendra, I am going to add this to a GitHub repo. I need to tidy some things up. I need to make it generically deployable, but I will do that within the next week or two. I promise. I'll get it out there. I'll put it on LinkedIn. So anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, Andy Cutler, and I'll put it up there with a series of steps for people to get themselves up and running. How does the data get populated in production when we use DBT? That's up to you. That is up to you. So essentially, this warehouse could be my production warehouse, right? Obviously, I'm just testing locally, but you will go through the same steps if you want to productionize, right? So ultimately, your DBT project could run on any warehouse in Fabric that you want it to, regardless of whether it's a production database or not. Orchestrating jobs. So there is something. So with all the different vendors. So if you're using Databricks, for example, Databricks has its own DBT scheduler within Databricks workflows. It's great, honestly. You can create a DBT action within a Databricks workflow, reference your DBT project that you've got on a GitHub repo or local to Databricks workspace, and then issue your DBT commands for what you want to do. For Fabric, there's something coming in pipelines that will allow you to do the same thing. Also, we can do it within Airflow. So, for example, Airflow is supported within Fabric. So we can actually define a DBT project and run it within Airflow. Outside of that, excuse me, you could run it on a container anywhere that can connect to Fabric, essentially. And yeah, there we go. So that's the last one. So, but yeah, so I am particularly interested when the functionality to run DBT gets added to Data Factory, gets added to pipelines. Then we're going to be able to orchestrate our DBT jobs. That'll be a game changer. Honestly, that'll be brilliant. Anyway, sorry, I've updated my raw data. So let's just make sure that in my lake house, we can see that raw data. I'm going to run that from there. And there we go. Okay, so our source system doesn't care about history because we've just updated it. We've got a row here. We've got the last updated. So 1st of March, it was updated. Now what I can do is the next time my DBT snapshot command runs, it goes, queries the data, sees that there's been a change based on joining to my business key and my last updated, and then does the necessary downstream. Let's have a look at my warehouse, and I'll open up a query actually and just look at the analysis. Let's run that. And there we go. Okay. So essentially, we've got our 2 event type, IDs. We've got our original one. DBT's automatically closed that record off. As I said, I've just put dates in here so you can have date times. Okay. I've just put dates in here to keep it simple. And then we've got our new dimension row with our DBT valid as null, which indicates that that is the current row. Okay, if I go back to there. Yep, and again, if you're running DBT, you don't need to just run DBT run. You can select folders, you can select specific models. If you want certain dimensions to run before other dimensions, or certain tables to be loaded before, or certain batches of tables to be loaded before next sections, you've got full control. But DBT is going to be managing all the dependencies in terms of what needs to be run when. So you don't need to create a process whereby, well, I need to run these 3 dimension tables before I run this fact table. DBT is going to do it for you as long as you're using this ref command to load from a table. That's the crux of how DBT generates the DAG. Okay, so
Andy,
this is the first time that I think I've done these with. Oh, yes,
no,
sorry.
that was
Jump
no.
in.
I was really enjoying the topic. It was really interesting. For me, maybe somehow new for me, and thousands of questions are coming to my in my actually mind. But and it is one of those sessions that I personally would prefer to rewatch the video and just going through the documentation, because lots of things is happening actually in DBT, right? And maybe
Yes.
I might have missed that, but the question that comes to me first: how the connection between DBT in Visual Studio Code, for example, is happening to the target or destination, and what is the the connection type? Is it connecting via API, or is there?
That's a very good question. So, yeah, let's open up Visual Studio. So, essentially, in my definition here, I've got a profiles file.
Mhm.
So, in my profiles file, this is where I'm getting my Fabric Warehouse SQL endpoint from. Right. So essentially, look, ODBC driver 18 for SQL Server. I haven't had to set up any ODBC connections, by the way, like locally. But yes, so essentially, I'm connecting to the SQL endpoint, connecting to a warehouse. So, gold is, DBT or DEDW DBT gold is the name I've given the warehouse. So it's running everything on that warehouse. Important to note when I've got those sources is that DBT will run a 3-part naming convention against the source. So even though I've said to DBT, well, these models load from this lakehouse, what DBT actually does is it runs a select command from the warehouse against the lakehouse.
Yeah,
So ultimately, DBT will be running select whatever from lakehouse.schema.table
I
name.
see.
Right. So it's not making a distinct connection just to the lakehouse to loading. Everything is being done from the warehouse itself, which, if anyone's ahead of me in terms of 3-part naming conventions, they may have the question of, oh, so does that mean I can't go and query something in another workspace? So no, ultimately. So you may have to have a lakehouse local with the data or with shortcuts, pointing to other workspaces that would contain the data. If you had a lake house that you were getting data from, it could be a warehouse.
I see. I see.
It could be essentially that your DBT models are being created from the warehouse, from a main enterprise data warehouse, and you're just creating smaller business focused models within the same warehouse. But yeah, this is where we are defining, we're defining the connection here. And then what I've done is my authentication is CLI, right? So I've just used AZ login to get an interactive login with my username that is authenticated against Fabric, and then I can carry on. I could do it using service principal, for example, if I go to production and I want to automate it.
Awesome. Cool. Perfect. Andy, as I mentioned, it is one of those sessions that I have to rewatch it to understand and then being fully in the context. I don't want to take the advantage of actually asking a lot of questions that comes from my side. But yeah, I know you've got some riddles for our members. Thank you very much for
Yes.
being here. And we had some thank you from Tony. Yeah, thank you very much. So, are you guys ready for riddles or not?
Okay. So what shall I do? Shall I just read the riddle out and then let people answer and then just
For
flick to
sure.
the
Yeah.
answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually,
All right then.
Andy, just before you just read that, usually we have, one or two, winners, right, for the riddles, and we are getting the 50%, exam voucher, Microsoft exam voucher that can be used for fundamental and associate exams. So yeah, here you go.
All right. Okay. So riddle 1, DBT, it works within the realm of data engineering, data warehousing, or analytics engineering. So is anyone coming through with okay?
And is C.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Whoops. Yes. So it's C, analytics engineering.
Okay, awesome.
Probably should have come up with green, but yeah. So it's analytics engineering.
Awesome.
Yep,
So our
there.
first,
Okay.
basically our first, answer was from Bhupendra. And we also had answers from Tony, Sahar. Yeah.
So next riddle. Or is it just one riddle that you wanted?
Yeah, actually, for voucher point of view, for one is enough for now, but the next one will be more fun. And yeah, let's
Okay. All right then. So
yeah.
riddle 2. Which of these is not a valid schema change option in DBT? So we can set it to ignore. We can set it to fail. We could update all columns. We could append new columns. Or we could sync all columns. One of those does not belong there.
Who was listening well? I can answer that.
Yes, there were 4 schema change options. So we could either ignore schema changes, we could fail if it detects. Is there a schema change option in which we could update the columns? Is there a schema change in which we could append new columns? Can we sync all columns? Is that a valid command?
We have one answer from Tony E, and also Upendra also E. Sahar is also say E. Sync all columns.
Well, unfortunately,
Can I say that?
go on then. You can
I
say
think
it.
it is C. Update all column.
That's correct. That's correct. We don't have a schema change option called update all columns. We can ignore, we can fail, we can append new columns, and we can sync all the columns. right? So update all column doesn't exist. I think I've got one more left.
Awesome. That's a good for knowledge
Okay,
check.
so essentially, when using the append new columns schema change option, DBT will drop columns in the destination that are not in the source. Is that true or is that false? So when you use the strategy of appending new columns, if your source has columns that were originally there and originally added downstream, if they're not there anymore, what does DBT do? Is it true that DBT will drop the columns in the destination?
Pupendra, false.
Okay.
Antonio, F, false. That
False. Okay.
also
So, yep.
false.
Okay.
Yeah. No, exactly.
It's false. So essentially, DBT will just ignore columns that have disappeared from the source and not do anything. So ultimately, if you're using Fabric Warehouse and you want to be able to advance the schema, append new columns is the one that's going to work.
Awesome, awesome. Andy, maybe the last question. I don't want to actually take your time. I know we are actually running over time. It is 17 minutes, and actually that we
That's
passed on the
okay.
hour. Uh, so in DBT, is there any chance to have the interaction? Let me just put it like this. Have you the interaction of seeing data like what we have in notebooks, for example, just seeing a sample of data, or watching what's happening in that model. Let's say it is called model, the select statements in dbt. Is there any chance to have
Yep.
them in the terminal or in the output somewhere like that?
Yeah. So ultimately,
Oh,
within
let me just share it.
the DBT project itself, we'll have the logs, right? So essentially, we've got DBT, running certain things. You can see in the log the actual commands that are being executed, right? So, for example, here you can see that when I've asked DBT to materialize dim product, or DBT behind the scenes will do certain things to be able to load downstream. So, for example, when it was loading dim product, it actually just created this temporary view to be able to run the logic required to load the table. So you can essentially see that DBT is using an exec statement to create a view. So it's doing that. There we go. Look, exec create table, right? It's added a label as well. And actually, in the warehouse query insights, which is a schema where some of the DMVs are added for you to query commands that have been run against the warehouse, you can actually search for label dbt-fabric-dw, and that will show you all the commands that have been executed on the warehouse. But yeah, so we've got logs here. I'm sure there's a verbose option that you can add into the terminal to be able to tell you what's happening
And what about the
with that
result
as
of
you go along. Certainly is for DBT Cloud. So in DBT Cloud, when you run models, you get two views. You get a summary view, which is what you have by default in DBT Core, but you also have a detailed view where you can see every single select statement that's been run as part of that DBT
yeah,
run.
yeah. That is awesome, to see how the actually script is going to be generated out of all of those models. And my question was mostly related to the result of this select statement. I mean, selecting the actual data. I know dbt is going to act in the transformation side of the elt process. But for
Mhm.
that transformation, we just want to check, always, we want to check, when we are transferring transforming actually the data. We want to see how that data looks like before landing into our destination. And is there anything like that, to see before, sending them to the target while we are doing the development of all of these models? Is it something?
I would, yeah. So I would say that you would be running them as tables. So if you had, so for example, my stage dates and event types and products, I've told DBT I don't need a table physically materialized with that data in. I'm just using a view because I've got some transformations. Yes, you're not going to be able to see that because it's just a view of data. So you could change that to a table while you're during development to be able to actually physically see, well, what data has been loaded into that table as it then goes downstream.
I understand. Awesome, awesome. Thank you very much, Andy. That was a really insightful session, and we can see that from people's comments, and absolutely you know valuable. And I'm going to just share my screen. So today the session with Andy is done. Our next session will be with Santosh. So it is 1 a.m. Pacific time. I'm not going to be in the Pacific time zone for March and April. Actually, rest of March and April, I will be in Australia. So I will connect with you guys from that time zone. So our sessions for April is going to be a slightly changed for just connecting with you guys. And if you missed the session, or if you'd like to just rewatch it, of course, and just feel free to go to the YouTube channel. Is immediately going to be available there, and just stay tuned for the next upcoming sessions on LinkedIn, a meetup, and you can just join us in our learning room. So I'm going to what's that? This one. I'm going to just wrap up the session. Thank you very much, Andy. It is really appreciated, and we everyone is looking forward to have you more actually in the community, and yeah, which is great, really. If you have something to add, feel free. If not, we can just wrap up the session and say goodbye to our attendees.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And yeah, like I said, getdbt.com. That's where you can go. Register your free account. You can get started with DBT Cloud for free. Out of the box connectivity to things like Fabric Warehouse and Databricks and Snowflake. They've got all their courses on there, the fundamentals of DBT through to the more advanced stuff. And also, if you like certifications, it's got a prep as well. Really everything you need. And then the DBT, boot camp on Udemy is a great course as well that will go into how to install DBT locally, how to integrate it into VS Code. So some of the more complex things if you want to get it working offline. Also, there is in the DBT documentation the recommended practices of how DBT themselves work with projects. So if you're new to DBT and you're learning DBT, I would say that have those recommended practices and read through those recommended practices, even if you don't understand them as you're going through the tutorials, because that'll stand you in good stead in terms of how to create your DBT projects, because you don't want to turn them into a big sprawling mess, which is kind of what happens because it's very easy to get up and
Of
running with
course.
DBT. But yeah, good luck,
And
everyone.
Andy, sorry, the last question that I wanted to ask actually during the session, but I just remembered about that. Maybe it can be the question from everyone. Uh, so we have all of those transformation and all of these activities for sure in Fabric itself, right? Using data flow, using notebook, and so on and so forth. We can just name on different ways. if you want to just give it in the short answer, what is the benefit of DBT here, and is it a good alteration of Fabric built-in tool, actually tools and components? Are we going to just replace them? Are we going to only adding another dependency to the project? And what is the main, you know, basically the main purpose of that and the main benefit of that?
I think that's a great question. So, like I said, Fabric is it's like the canvas and the paintbrushes, but it doesn't necessarily paint the picture for you. You have to come and you're the one that's having to define your objects and your schemas and things like that, and your dependencies and how things are wired up. And you need to run these table loading processes before these other table loading processes, and so on and so forth. So you can totally use all of the Fabric elements. Use pipelines to chain together and create your DAG manually. Right, these need to run before this needs to run, before this needs to run. You can use data flows to do your transformations and your actual loading of dimension tables, for example. But these are all objects that you've got to create, you've got to manage, and you're doing this all manually, really. Whereas with DBT, you're declaring what you want your downstream models, your downstream schemas to look like. You don't have to explicitly define it. You're letting DBT manage it. And the other thing is, if you want to change technology, move from one platform to the other, with some syntax changes, you should be able to just redo that. So there's a certain amount of transportability involved in there as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much for your brief actually explanation. And guys,
No
of
problem.
course, you
Enjoyed
can
it.
just
Thank you.
ping Andy if you have any question. And we are looking forward to have the actually your codes and more maybe documentation on your GitHub. And of course, it is going to be shared with members on your LinkedIn, or you can also just mention us or underneath of the post of your session that is going to be shared again, the recording of that. Of course, it can be part of that kind of communication. So with that said, let's wrap up the session. Thanks everyone. We are an hour and a half for today's session. There are again lots of questions, but let's just rewatch the video and learn more about DBT. Thanks everyone, and thanks Andy for your time. And yeah, with that said, have a great weekend. Enjoy your time and enjoy learning.